Hello and welcome to Sci Cam, the online magazine-style science show. I'm Michael Conterio, and joining me this month is Robin Lamble.
Hello.
I'm going to kick things off with a story that's been in the news recently, which I think is really, really nice and just shows how some simple physics can be put together in ways that it just makes you really happy about how innovative people are being with simple ideas. And in this case, it's origami robots, which is the news that at MIT, some researchers there have put together small little robots where they are basically made up from originally a flat um, substrate, which they've carefully designed so that it will then fold itself into a robot shape, which can then walk along using the motors that they put on top of it. And the way that they've done this is by making a material out of several different layers, and they're actually quite a lot of the layers are really mundane. In the middle of it, it's got what is effectively a flexible printed circuit board on a copper polyamide um, strip. And then above and below that, they've actually got layers of paper, which don't do anything active in the structure, but are actually really important for a reason that I'll come on to in a minute. And then above and below that, what they've got there is they've got some heat shrinking plastic. This is very similar to what you might have seen if you ever had to deal with electronics. A lot of these are used to basically seal off bits of electronics between wires touching where they've been soldered. You start off with like a plastic tube, thin plastic tube, slide that over, and then just with a hairdryer, you can just heat that up, and it'll shrink and contract and actually hold on to that. And what these scientists at MIT have done is they've taken that and used it to create this self-folding robot. So obviously, with the tubes that we put on electrical wires to just make sure there's no contacts loose that people can touch, then it's just all shrinking all the way around. But mostly it's shrinking in kind of two dimensions. If you imagine the roll, that if you flattened it out, then its thickness wouldn't change so much, but the other two dimensions would. And that's what they're doing in these robots, because they've got little bits of little miniature heaters which are in part of the printed circuit board, because as you know, when you put electric current through a wire, it will start to heat up because of the resistance of the wire. And so they're basically using that to heat up specific bits of the folding robot. And when that heats a particular area, that area shrinks. But in order to make sure that it shrinks and folds nicely, what they've got is they've cut out, using laser machining, very accurate gaps in the paper where the folds are. So if you can imagine that you've got your printed circuit board in the middle and you've got some paper on it, and you've got two edges here with a gap which you've specifically machined, when that gets pulled in, eventually the bits of paper will actually contact each other. And depending on the size of the gap, the wider the gap, the more it has to move before they actually touch each other. And so you can actually control how much it folds by, because the forces involved are so small that this thickness of paper coming into contact with another piece of paper will actually stop it from folding anymore. And they've got a bunch of different folds like that. And then in addition to that, they've got a really nice set of design linkages which effectively fold over and contact the axle of a motor, a little electrical motor which they put on there, which is actually sadly not flat. That's the only bit of this that's disappointing, the fact that they have to have just kind of ordinary light motors on it. But basically the rest of the robot will fold into that, and then it'll actually form a set of linkages, which means it's got some little legs which can scurry around. If you can look it up, I'll put the link to the site, the actual paper, up after this hangout is over, and then there'll be a video that you can watch there. It takes about 4.5 minutes for this robot to go from being flat to actually being a full robot that can scuttle around, although if you look at the video it's not quite as accurate as you might hope for a scuttling robot, but it'll get there eventually, and you'll be able to watch that. But yes, the other interesting thing is, because it's all stuff that's kind of known about, there's nothing really new in the production of this, besides the fact that they've had to do a lot of programming and a lot of careful designing in order to get all these folds right, in order to get it to actually form a nice shape that when the motors are there, it'll latch onto the motors. You'll have shafts going from the motors to the legs that'll actually allow all the legs to move. There's no new materials on here. These are all well-known materials. So each of these robots, they reckon, if you discount the motors, which are quite cheap anyway, then they reckon it costs about $19 to produce one. And so yeah, you can imagine that this might be of use in places where you want to get a robot out there quickly, but you don't particularly care. It doesn't have to be particularly strong. It doesn't have to be particularly fast. But you don't want to have to worry about it getting damaged because it's a $19 robot. I mean, you're not going to worry massively about sending those into unstable situations. And this idea of the origami, so it means that also, as well as it being all nice and it was springing up from the flat piece of paper, it is a really nice property that you've got something which is quite big coming from something that you can make incredibly compact. And one place that I can imagine this actually going forward and actually being used again is the idea of solar sails. And this is something that NASA are actually currently working on. I believe they've got a big mission planned for early next year, and actually to try and get one of these working. And that's the idea that if you have a big enough sail in space, then you can effectively catch the light from the sun, and all of the particles that have been blown away by the radiation pressure will actually give you enough of a push for you to actually get a decent amount of movement going on. You need a ridiculously huge sail because obviously the forces due to the light are really, really incredibly tiny. And you also want this sail to be really light as well, because if you've got tiny forces pushing something heavy, then it's going to be a ridiculously small acceleration. And so you have to send these things up. But of course, when you're actually sending stuff up into space, you want it to be nice and compact. So you have to be very careful with how you fold these materials. And I can imagine this sort of origami kind of materials and self-assembly, which it's called self-assembly because you don't actually have to actively fold it yourself. You just have to add some heat to it, and it will just naturally form the shape that you want. You can imagine that would be very useful for a solar sail mission. But yeah, so this possibly could be an exciting technology of the future. And the sad thing is, they did actually try and make 3 of these, but only one of them fully worked. And it turns out that one problem with this way of manufacturing is that all of the folds and all of the operation of this depend on each other. So if you have one fold that goes wrong out of the, I think it's 90 odd folds that you actually need to create one of these, then the robot just won't work. And that's what happened in 2 of the 3 robots. So despite the fact they had well over 90% success in the folds, they still only ended up with 1 of the 3 robots actually working. So that's something they may have to consider with future applications. But there you go, made from paper and a bit of plastic, it's effectively your very own transformer. So I'm looking forward to see where they go in the future. Any questions, Robin?
So presumably this is not reversible because it's paper. Like you can't then flatten the robot out and do it again.
No, this isn't a reversible process. There are some kind of shape memory materials where you can reverse the process, but this is one where it's just one way. As you heat it up, it kind of relaxes into this shape. Well, and that also means that there could be a bit of a problem if you actually allow the whole thing to get too hot, because what we call the transition temperature, where the folding will actually occur, the shrinking will actually occur, is about 100 degrees centigrade. And that means that there's a limit on how hot the entire robot can get. Because if you start, if other bits of the robot hit that temperature, then it just all crinkles, and then it'll just completely not work. So yeah, it's only a one-way thing for now, but it's feasible that in the future they may actually be able to create some which are in fact reversible. Although I can imagine that being a much harder problem, because obviously because it all depends on the temperature. If it's reversible, you have to make sure that you keep it at the right temperature, and obviously that's a lot harder than just getting it warm.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, so if you've got any questions about that, feel free to stick them in the comments on the YouTube or Google Plus page, and we'll get back to them later and see if we can answer them for you. So what have you got for us, Robin, this month?
Yeah, I'm going to talk to you about the Klein paradox. It's called a paradox. It's actually not a paradox. It's just really weird. So most physicists try and think about it as though it's one. In order to understand it, you've got to know sort of the basics of classical physics and how that transitions into quantum mechanics. So let's start out with the classical picture. You've got a marble and you've got a hill. And you flick the marble, and it hopefully rolls up the hill if you flicked it hard enough, if you gave it enough kinetic energy. But if you don't flick it hard enough, it goes a little bit up the hill and then rolls back down again. Okay, so that's the basic quantum picture. That's the basic classical picture. Quantum mechanics, though, is what happens when things get really, really small, and things get a little bit more complicated. There's a boundary problem here. So in quantum mechanics, you don't know exactly where something is. You've got a sort of waveform that tells you where it might be. And that waveform can go into places where you might think something couldn't possibly be. So in this case, you don't have marbles, you don't really have hills, you've got maybe an electron, and you can have an electric field that repels the magnet, that tells it not to go. If you flick the electron hard enough, it can still climb up, as it were, the electric field and keep going if it's got enough energy. If it doesn't have enough energy, though, it has some chance of being reflected, but it also has some chance of going through the electric field that you've put there. And if you've got a small electric field and then an end to the electric field over here, it has a chance of tunneling through. In the classical picture, you flick it up, it either goes over, and if it gets to the top, it'll keep going however long it is, but if it doesn't have enough, it doesn't go up at all. In the quantum picture, it will only really have any chance of going through if the hill is very narrow. So for real hills, as it were, real physical walls and stuff with physical tennis balls, it's never going to get through. It's too big, the hill is too wide, the energy difference is too big. But with the really, really toned down cases, you can get interesting things like tunneling of electrons through electric fields that they shouldn't be able to classically penetrate. And this is really useful for electron microscopy and stuff like that, because it can tell you exactly how thick your potential well, your energy hill, as it were, is. Klein's paradox is something that's a step beyond that. So in quantum mechanics, if you want to save your students a bit of work, you'll tell them, okay, pretend that the quantum well is infinitely deep, that this potential barrier here goes off to infinity. In this case, the wave function can't penetrate it at all. Or so you'd think. If you actually do the full relativistic quantum mechanics, if you bother using an even more complicated equation, it actually turns out there's another effect that comes into place, and this is Klein's paradox. So if your potential step becomes higher energy for an electron to go through it, then the electron's mass converted into an energy using Einstein's E=mc² law, then you have enough energy that you need to start worrying about what if new electrons were created. And in quantum mechanics, you always have vacuums that are filled with particles or things that kind of react a bit like particles and antiparticles, which are like particles but with the opposite charge. So an electron's antiparticle is called a positron. Electrons are negatively charged, positrons are positively charged. So your positron sees, instead of a hill, there's a huge valley here. It would love to roll down that valley and it'll keep going with no trouble at all. The electron, of course, still sees that there is a hill here, so it's still in trouble. But if your electron initially knocks into this, it can create particle-antiparticle pairs inside this hill, valley, whatever it is now, no one knows. If the energy difference is big enough, it doesn't care that there's this hill, valley, superposition thingy, whatever it is. And so it can propagate through pretty much freely in the limit that the hill, valley thing, energy barrier, goes off to actually infinity. Now, we really are talking about very large electric fields that you need here to actually see this, because the mass of an electron isn't very big, but c, the speed of light, is big. So mass times the speed of light squared is a lot of energy. So you need to have an awful lot of energy in order to get over that, to get to the stage where that's relevant. But this sort of thing does have similarities to the way that you can get things out of black holes. We think of black holes as being something that sucks everything in, and yeah, that's pretty much what happens. But with really, really small black holes, things can get out. More directly, this Klein paradox is interesting if you had a massless electron. Now, normally you can't have massless electrons, you know, they've got masses, you can't pretend something doesn't have a mass. Except sometimes, if you've got a collection of electrons moving around, you can kind of pretend that they're all one electron, and it's moving as a lump, because whatever all the other electrons around the outside are doing all kind of cancels out. And it looks like there is just one electron moving through a vacuum, except it's got the wrong mass. You've got to account for the fact that actually there's loads of weird stuff going on there. So you pretend it's like one particle, but it's got a different mass. And in graphene, this is this one nanoscopic, we pretend it's a microscopic, well, a single layer of graphite. Usually there are several layers there because it's difficult to get things where there's only one atom thick, but hopefully it's something like one atom thick of graphite of carbon. Basically, you can have these sort of like an electron with zero mass. So you need to worry about the fact that actually you can create these things that can do tasks which are so impossible they become easy. And that's what I was going to talk about today. So thank you, Michael.
So that's all very interesting. You said that you need really huge electric fields in order for this to become, for this actually to happen, for you to get the electrons seemingly going straight through this. And you also said that you're talking about you've got your electron and your positron. Is the fact that you need large electric fields sort of related to the fact that you've got an electron and a positron which are kind of created in the same place, but have, like, because they've got opposite charges attract. That's something we learn at high school. So normally they just attract each other, and when matter and antimatter collides, it just produces energy again. So is this why you need a large electric field? Because then you can pull them apart and send them off in different directions?
Sort of. So basically in quantum mechanics, when the vacuum is being weird and there are all these particles, antiparticles popping up everywhere, this happens literally all of the time, or something that mathematically approximates to it is, but they don't have the right masses. If their mass is really, really badly wrong, they don't stay around for very long at all. It's when their mass becomes pretty much exactly the mass they would be if they were real, proper, normal particles that stay around forever, that you actually have them seriously interacting with everything. So, in a sense, yes, it's when the energy that you're thinking about is about the right energy to actually make another particle, and then these particles will want to interact. They'll want to stay together. It's not so much that you can sort of split one off and then throw one through the barrier and then the other one can do whatever it likes. They do have to sort of stick together because you can only borrow stuff from the vacuum. They have to combine again at the end and give you back what you started with, which was just the one electron. And out the other side, you can only get one electron because you can only borrow things from the vacuum. But yeah, that's the general idea.
Hey, thank you very much. I like the fact that we've gone in this episode from stuff made out of bits of plastic and paper to going to stuff which is just really kind of effectively quite high level quantum physics weirdness. But we've managed to keep a running theme because you talked about graphene then. We've managed to keep a running theme of things that were flat because the robot started out flat and the graphene is flat.
Yes. And the energy level at the top should be flat as well, because otherwise the maths gets a lot harder.
But yeah, so very strange physics there. That's all we've got time for this month. So thank you very much, Robin, for taking us, I think, a lot further than I did. in my
Well,
part today.
thank you for having me on the show.
And we'll be back again with another show in a month's time. So that'll be early September, second Tuesday of the month. And also in the meantime, there will be some blog posts going up still. We've not quite managed one every week, but we're trying very hard to make sure that we get lots of interesting things. If you like the idea of brain-eating amoeba, then definitely check out the blog. That was the most recent post that's gone up there at www.contrarythoughts.com/sci-cam. And you can comment on there if any of the sites is confusing you. Comment on here if you were watching this video later when it wasn't live and any of the sites here has confused you. And we'll try and get back to you. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you again next month. Bye-bye.
Bye.